So for today's video, I'd like to go over this article, which was published on rxmuscle.com. It was written by Greg Kovacs, and it recounts his experience at the 2011 Toronto Pro in Canada, where Greg was basically helping rxmuscle.com. As you can see, he's in a photo here doing the wrap-up with Canadian pro bodybuilder Ron Partlow and IFBB judge John Hanadishak. And Greg, he's next to basically an off-season Ron Partlow, who's a massive man, and maybe somewhere around 300 pounds in this photo. And Greg is both taller than him by about 1.5 inches. Greg is 6'2" and heavier than him. Greg probably here was 365 pounds. He was at least 350. I can tell you, having been there that weekend, I saw Greg, and I was also watching the 2011 Ontario Strongest Man contest at that expo. And Greg was bigger than all of the competitors there, as well as the promoter and MC of that contest, Hugo Girard, who was multiple time Canada's strongest man. So you got to think this is a massive person, even though he was far away from his competition shape. So think about that. He was well into his off season, and tragically only around 2.5 years before his death, his early death, his young death on November 22nd, 2013 of heart failure, which was basically less than a month away from his 45th birthday. He would have been turning 45 on December 16th of that year. So that's unfortunate, but Greg was a massive man to the very end, and of course that did contribute unfortunately to his early demise. And I can tell you that Greg left family members. I know from talking to his sister a little bit on Facebook, and he left parents who no doubt were sad about it. I mean, these are people who missed him and were sad about his death. So his size and his bodybuilding competitive background basically came at a cost. You can do a search in my channel for other videos I've done on Greg Kovacs, and it's unfortunate. And I kind of wonder also what kind of a life really was it to be anywhere ranging from 300 pounds in competition, which was 1996, which was like it was his best showing, but granted it was his probably most depleted size from 1996 until his death. And he was up to 416 pounds, 412, 416, depending on reports. Some say as much as 420. The most I've seen Greg say about that was 416. I've seen him report. It's around there, right? So it was over 400 pounds, which he was consistently. 385 pounds would have been light for him. That was his weight at the 2005 Toronto Pro in Canada, and he had abs showing. I mean, granted, he wasn't in super ripped condition. At the Arnold, the year prior to that, 2004 Arnold Classic, he was 335. In competition shape, as best as he could be. Granted, given that you might say that I think that he bulked up so much that it sort of produced in his body an appearance that was irreversible due to the bulking, the food intake, the drug intake, and everything that it took to get to over 400 pounds. I think that did sort of exact a toll on Greg's body, which made it so even though he was in condition in 2004, it was impossible for him to look as he previously did. Prior to that, he had competed from 1990 onwards, I would say, that I'm aware of. And that was age 21, where he would have competed in 1990, and he was massive at that time. He was, I think, 275 pounds in contest, and just a massive man. And basically, he never, other than probably that contest in 1990, his early 90s contests where he might have been just under 300. I would say from any time from around 1986 to his death, he might have always been over 300 pounds. So here's a man that lived quite possibly 27 years of his life. Like basically from about 18 to about 45, which he didn't make, but pretty close. And he was at that time over 300 pounds. So I don't know of too many times where he was under 300. And there were definitely many times in that time frame that he was over 300. And in fact, he was over 400 probably from 1996 in the off season, 1995 in the off season to 2013. So this is a guy that spent basically 18 years where much of his time was spent over 400 pounds. And without question, I would say, I mean, I didn't read the autopsy or anything like that. I'm not a doctor, but I would say that unquestionably that contributed to his early death, as well as we could always sort of speculate as to what the drug usage was to get to that level, and the food consumption, which I would say also would have contributed. But I can speak alone on his body weight, which I think did play a role. Now, in this article, Greg goes on and speaks a little bit about his experiences. And essentially, he starts off by saying that the Toronto Pro Super Show was this past weekend, and I was in attendance on behalf of RX Muscle. I took this opportunity to relax, take in the show, and hang out with old friends. I was thinking about it, and I realized that it was the first pro show I had attended in over 5 years. Moreover, I was not obligated to be at a booth working. I was truly free. So I guess the most recent pro show he was at would have maybe been the 2005 Toronto, where he competed. And it's interesting that he speaks about actually being able to relax and enjoy a show, because his life was so much involved, like on the go, autograph signings, traveling around with Muscle Tech, that as successful as he was in that capacity, and as a bodybuilder spokesman for Muscle Tech, he didn't necessarily have a lot of time to do anything except for eat and basically train and travel. mean, what kind of a life really was that? I mean, granted he did want to be the biggest bodybuilder in the world. That's what he allegedly told my friend, who, when he came to Thunder Bay, and my friend met him at the nutrition house here. But regardless, I mean, this was one time for Greg to actually enjoy a contest for once, pretty much. So it's sort of unfortunate. Greg states, one guy sticks out in my mind more than anyone else. He came right up to me and pointed out that I wasn't carrying the towel and sweating profusely like I used to. Honestly, I felt flattered that he remembered me walking around in such detail, that he remembered my towel and fan. But the fact that this guy remembered him, Greg Kovacs, like that, it's because that's basically what a good portion of Greg's life at Expos was at that time, which is sort of unfortunate. It makes me think, what kind of a life really is that to lead or to live, I guess. It's kind of sad in a sense, but it is sort of what Greg wanted, but I would think it would be incredibly uncomfortable. So this is probably what I think the best portion of this article is, and Greg writes, a funny thing happens when you sit back and observe. You notice things you otherwise would miss. I notice that a lot of bodybuilding fans think that their heroes are just that, heroes. We are expected to be at our biggest and leanest all the time. Sadly, we're human and we can't possibly hold our condition and or size all the time. Even more astounding, many expected this even after we have retired. I repeatedly heard the same thing. I can't believe how small he is. I overheard that comment several times, and it was in reference to several different legends. And he put that legends in quote. I found this amusing. In bodybuilding, we are judged on our appearance, so when our appearance fades, it is apparent to everyone. Our appearance can be perceived as our relative skill level. In other sports, skill level is demonstrated within the act or performance of the sport. When a bodybuilding enthusiast meets the legend that has long since retired, the legend will be smaller. The bodybuilder has retired, his skill fades and he gets smaller. However, in other sports, Wayne Gretzky or Michael Jackson will always appear to be who they are. You can't see their skill fading away, even though they couldn't perform like they did in their prime. The idea or memory of how they used to perform is still in your head, unchallenged by a current visualization of the deterioration of their skill level. To bring it back to bodybuilding, why would it be surprising that Dorian Yates is smaller than he used to be? I am certainly not over 400 pounds anymore, and I am certainly not incline pressing 6 plates anymore. What I am trying to get at is that in bodybuilding, it is inevitable that when an IFBB pro retires, he will get smaller, and it has the tendency to let down enthusiasts' expectations. I have always heard that meeting your hero is always a letdown because they can never live up to your expectations. Maybe that is this phenomenon at work. And this is unfortunately actually a very good description of what happens in bodybuilding and powerlifting. I feel that my friends who enjoy bodybuilding and powerlifting sort of have a lot invested in terms of their self-esteem in either one, or strongman for that matter, but bodybuilding, powerlifting, strongman, and sort of their size is dependent often on high food intake. I would say for sure high food intake, steroid consumption to some extent or a great extent. And when they if they were to ever retire from it, they would lose their size, which would make it obvious to everyone that they aren't as strong as they once were. This is sort of why I like the natural approach when it comes to bodybuilding, because I'm just going to shrink back down to maybe 170 anyway. I've actually taken the dive to 160 even lately because I want to be especially healthy, but I can still attempt to lift most of what I do, and people will see me, and even if I'm as skinny as possible, people will still assume I could bench press 3 plates because I sort of have done that before at like my smallest or in the 170s. But when bodybuilders get off their drug protocols and don't consume as much food and don't work out as much, everybody can tell that they're not the bodybuilder, the strongman powerlifter that they once were. And that's unfortunate. I think that makes people who participate in those ventures very sort of invested in staying big forever. And this is of course what happened to Greg, where his self-esteem to some extent was invested into being so big, and he was 365 pounds in 2012. I read that was basically the size that he was until his death. I would say 365 pounds. So, and if it wasn't 365, it might have been 350. I don't know of any photo anywhere really in recent times, like in the past since 1995 until his death, where Greg was under 350. I can't think of any time other than the 2004 Arnold Classic, where he was depleted at 335 or 338 even. So he was always very large. But this is sort of I get maybe like a cautionary tale to people who get really involved in bodybuilding, strongman, powerlifting, because it is something that tends to capture people and it becomes addictive in its own way. And I feel like it's hard to go back to normal after having reached such a peak. And that's unfortunately what keeps people involved in it. And these activities give people a sense of belonging, I find. And I decided that since I'm only going to be a 170 pound man or what have you myself, or I might be able to be a bit larger, I could probably be 200 pounds and a bit softer just on whole foods, but I've decided that since I'm never going to really be that large of a man anyway, that I might as well just do it the natural way and enjoy it. But I think this goes to show why a lot of bodybuilders hang on to their muscle and most likely use drugs to get that way. Marcus Ruhl is another example who's 285, and he's turned 44 in February, and he's massive. Kevin Levrone is coming back to the Mr. Olympia this year. When bodybuilders do die young, Greg Kovacs, for example, I'm sure this was the case with Art Atwood as well, other people do know these men. People are friends with them, are family with them, and people love them. And when they die, we might just write on the boards about how it's steroids and whatnot, but somebody did lose their life, and the other people around them lost perhaps their brother, their son, their uncle, friend, and it's kind of tragic. So I do hope that people can maybe consider some safety when it comes to steroids and some time off and so on. But that's the topic of a whole new video. I just really liked what Greg said about how with other sports, it doesn't really show when they retire from sport and so on. They look like they always did. And that's very important. The other thing is about this is I think it's kind of sad that Greg, it took this late in his life, in his relatively short life, before he sort of started to discover his identity outside of just being a sort of a freak to be viewed at an autograph signing, much like a circus animal or much like a circus freak. It's kind of sad, So it's just something to think about. And another video, I'm going to try to write down 100 topics for videos that are kind of easy to just shoot the breeze about and speak about, and post one a day, I hope, because that would be a really cool format to do. Just kind of put 100 down on paper and go through them one by one. So thank you again for watching. Be sure to continue to follow and subscribe if you haven't. Thank you very much. I will be back.